Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Rich. Today, I really have a fantastic show with you. I have on Dr. William Moravits. Did I pronounce your last name correctly, sir?
Yes, sir.
And I've been practicing. It's good. Hey, real quick, before I read Dr. Moravits' impressive bio, I want to thank everyone that's going to watch in today's show, everyone that's going to be watching on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Everyone that's going to be listening to today's podcast, you're going to want to share this with someone. My name is Rich Brown. I'm the co-host, co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, America's leading self-defense podcast. I'm a retired Marine Corps officer, former police officer, corrections officer, special operations officer. I was also a regional manager for disaster preparedness at the Red Cross, and a man of letters. And I am joined this morning by Dr. Moravits. Let me read Dr. Moravits' impressive bio here. He is a lecturer of political science for Alamo Community College and Texas State University. For 3 years, he was a police officer for the city of San Marcos, Texas, having graduated top cadet from the Basic Training Academy of the University of Texas at Austin. He holds a Master's of Arts in Political Science from Texas State University and a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Walden University. He is a native of Uvalde, Texas. I'm probably butchered that name.
Uvalde. That's okay.
Okay. Jared is on from Montana. Thank you to the 10 folks watching us live. Please share. You're going to want to watch this one a couple of times, folks, because I finished reading Dr. Moravits' book last night. It is absolutely outstanding. It is The Blue Divide. I have a link in today's show notes so you can go and pick that up over at Amazon. You can find it at Walmart, anywhere you buy books. And Dr. Moravits, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Tony is on. Will Parker is on. Please like and hit that share button today, because we're going to talk about a very hot topic, a very timely topic. Like I told you before we came on this morning, Dr. Moravits, I think it took a lot of courage to write the book that you wrote. But before we get into your amazing book, tell me, what does your bio overlook?
Well, actually, I spent a lot of time in ministry right after college. I was kind of at a point where I was thinking of going to grad school, but I was kind of tired of college. And so I heard an opportunity to be a youth minister. And, they were hiring people throughout the region. I was Episcopalian at the time. And so I took a job in Seguin, Texas, which is a small town, majority Hispanic, and did that for a couple of years, and then got married and moved to San Antonio. And 9/11, of course, it happened that previous year. And I started to really think about becoming a police officer. I thought about going into the military. My family's full of military. Unfortunately, I have a hearing loss since I was a kid. So I failed the hearing test at MEPS. But I was able to pass the hearing test for the police physical. So it's a lot easier. Anyway, so I did that for 3 years, and family life problems, took me away from law enforcement. And then when I got divorced, my children were 3 and not quite 2. So I thought, do I go back to law enforcement and, not be very often? My dad wasn't around when I grew up. So I decided, I'll go into teaching. That's what most of my other members of the family do. And I did couple of years at a Catholic middle school, and that's where I met my wife, Rosie. And then I taught at a public high school just outside San Antonio for several years, and now moved into full time at the college level. So, and I guess one more thing it's relevant to the discussion is in my 30s, I did do 4 years of mixed martial arts. I spent the gym that I would go to shut down and became a jiu-jitsu gym, and I kind of stopped training, unfortunately. But, for about 4 years, I was going at least 3 days a week, a couple hours a day, practicing on my own and learning all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's never too late to get back in it. I got a seminar all weekend with the esteemed Cecil Birch. So Cecil, looking forward to training with you this weekend, brother. But I want to get right into it. Why did you write The Blue Divide: Policing and Race in America?
Well, I had been following the Black Lives Matter movement, I guess. It started before Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, but that's really the incident, the hands up, don't shoot mantra is really what got things moving nationally for that organization. And when I looked back to the Michael Brown incident and I read, the actual, what actually happened and things like that, it was clear to me that it was a legitimate, justified shoot. And as, time went on, we add more names to the list of well-known deaths of Black men and one Black woman, Breonna Taylor, by police. And then after George Floyd was killed, and the massive protests, 7% of which were turned into riots, caused the most property damage in American history, cost, I think, something like 19 lives of Black people who died in those riots. And then the defunding the police, the abolishing the police that was coming from the squad, the AOC and Cori Bush and those Congress people. And I thought, I've been teaching a lot of what's in my book. I would teach in my classes, and I thought I got to reach a bigger audience. I got to try at least, to get the message out there to more members of the public. And so that's what I did. I sat down and got a lot of encouragement from my wife and got it done.
Well, like I've told you before in the pre-show, I'm so glad you wrote this because somebody needs to start this conversation. And thank you for having the courage to do it. Let's start with, and I love the way your book is laid out too, Dr. Moravits, in that, you describe let me explain to you what use of force policy is, how it comes to be, how it's legally defendable, where does it generate from, and you walk it right through. Then you look at a lot of the cases that all of us know. And while I say that, I think it's interesting also to stop and pause for a moment. If there really was, as LeBron James says, that African-American men and women are being hunted by the police, and I don't mean to laugh, but it's such a silly idea. We would have no idea. These would be nameless, faceless, countless men and women that have lost their lives. But it's not. It's names that all of us Americans know. We can recite them and probably tell you the facts surrounding each and every case because there are so few of them. I think it's roughly 8 to 10 a year of unarmed Black men and women, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the question I have to begin with is, what is the purpose of law enforcement? You were a cop. What is the purpose?
Well, I like to think that, to kind of paraphrase the thin blue line between order and chaos, our job, yes, is to protect and serve. But, we have to understand that there is evil in this world. There are people that choose to do very evil things. And it's our job to the best of our ability, protect people from those evil things. Beyond that, of course, you have other more mundane tasks like making sure people are following traffic laws and things like that. But it truly is a service based industry where profession where you are actively, you're putting your life on the line every single day for people that you probably won't ever meet and you probably won't ever get any thanks for it. And you just get abused on the job. You get called names, you get, into scuffles with people and you're doing this because you care about your community. You're doing this because you care about right and wrong. You're doing it because you care about protecting those who, can't or won't or are unable to protect themselves. It's like, I forget the military officer that came up with this saying, and you may know the name off the top of your head, but, he says there's basically 3 types of people in the world. There's sheep, sheepdogs, and wolves. Oh, yeah. And police are the sheepdogs protecting the sheep from the wolves. My favorite author, Brad Thor, who writes a lot of thrillers, counterterrorism, he said there's a 4th category, which is the wolf hunter. So I like that too. But I think that's the purpose of law enforcement.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. I think that a lot of times people think, I remember when I was a corrections officer, an African-American inmate and I were having a chat in the pod one day, and he was telling me how he's like, yeah, I love to mess with the police there, Officer Brown. I said, oh, you do? He's like, yeah, the housing project they live in, I think it was Walter P. Taylor. He says, yeah, we'll call him down there and say, get that cat out of the tree, protect and serve, right? And he just thought that was hilarious.
That's a firefighter job. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. You called the wrong person. Dispatch. What are you doing? No, but I think that I look at law enforcement as nothing much more than that. I'm here to enforce the law without passion or prejudice. If I can help and save people in the process, that's fantastic, because that goes with who I am as a person. But I'm just here to be law enforcement. And I think that I say that because I think there's a misunderstanding in America. Like, I'm here to carry your groceries or do a TikTok dance with you or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that is not necessarily what I'm here for. And of course, Dr. Fuller, who's joining us this morning, he's a retired FBI agent. He says Lieutenant Colonel Grossman is the sheepdog. Yeah,
that's correct. Thank you for that, Mr. Fuller, Dr. Fuller.
Yeah, you'll get it right now. He's really serious about that. No,
I'm kind of laid back. You see my display name. The only people that I expect to call me doctor are my students, and even then it's Dr. M. That's just kind of my personality. But
no, that's great. How did we get to this point in America where there is such a divide that a book such as yours is necessary? I mean, how did we get to the point where communities of color and the law enforcement that serves them are at such odds?
Well, the history of policing and Black America, especially in the South, 60, 70 years ago and beyond, no doubt was discriminatory. No doubt there was a lot of racist cops. A lot of cops were members of the KKK throughout the South. And we've all heard the stories. We've all read about civil rights. I love teaching that subject. And unfortunately, there were a lot of people that abused their authority because of their negative feelings towards, their feelings towards Black Americans. But I think, starting maybe in the mid 80s, early 90s, you really start to see a huge change in outcomes, as far as sentencing in the prison system, treatment of communities of color. I think it was in the early 90s, we started moving towards this community policing model. And things got a lot better. I think as society, as things progressed, racism became less and less prevalent, to the point where, Thomas Sowell writes, in paraphrasing, where he says, the racism is on life support, but it's kept alive by these race hustlers that profit from it. And I think, I grew up on the border, not a lot of African Americans in that area, not a lot of white people either, really, but I understand the history behind there, and I think people just assume that history is continued. And in the early 2000s, not late 90s, early 2000s, my perception as I graduated college and spent a lot of time around people of color was that things were pretty darn good. I did not vote for President Obama, but when he got elected, I was like, okay, fine, the race card is dead. Yes. But it actually got worse after he was elected. And, people say, oh, Trump divided everybody. And you could argue that. I'm not going to, go back and forth on that. But it started with Obama. His rhetoric, the way he addressed some of these issues like Trayvon Martin, or when his buddy, the Harvard professor, was arrested trying to break into his own home, the beer summit that they had with the officer and the professor. And I think the way he just kind of made people, I think he made it okay for people not to like the police, mm-hmm. to not trust the police. And the media has jumped in full bore with that. Race sells. They're private organizations. They got to make money. They got to make profit, sell advertising so they can stay on the air, make the money that they make. So anytime a Black person's killed by police in any kind of, less than obvious circumstances, some Black guys shooting at a police officer and then they shoot back, the national media is not going to probably pay much attention to that. But, they do, they totally ignore, when police kill white people. But yeah, they further that divide. And then the final little piece of that puzzle, I think, is academia. For decades, critical race theory was taught in law schools only. Now it's kind of filtered down to the undergrad level, and then now it's filtering down, or its derivatives have filtered into modern society, like Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I mean, that's taught in the military, that's taught in corporate America, that's definitely pushed at the college level. So I think all those factors combined have really distorted the reality between police and the society that we serve.
No, excellent answer. And I absolutely agree with that. And on that topic, we talk about the media, but what is also the role of celebrity in the 21st century and fanning these flames of racial animus?
Yeah, prior to social media, you could kind of ignore celebrities a lot of times if you didn't watch sport. But with social media, they have such a wide reach where they can talk directly to their fans. And that's a good thing in some ways. Like with politicians, it's good that, you can read a tweet from your representative and not have to have it filtered by the media. But, the reality is that they do have a big influence on society. I think the two biggest individuals that have further divide are obviously Colin Kaepernick and LeBron James. Kaepernick, I've always kind of brushed off as uneducated as far as the reality. I mean, he talks a big game, but he didn't even vote in 2016. So it's like, okay, great. You're sitting for the national anthem. Now you're kneeling, wearing pig socks, at practice. But LeBron, I think, has a far bigger reach worldwide. And, some of the things that he said and tweeted about the Ahmaud Arbery, which, again, those three people in Georgia were all found guilty of murder. But the other one, the one that I point out in my book, is when Officer Reardon shot and killed Ma'Khia Bryant, roughly around the time that the Chauvin trial verdict was coming out. He put a picture of Reardon, like his actual picture, and put "You're next." He claims he meant "you're next" to go to trial or whatever, but it could be very well meaning "you're next to die." And he was totally wrong. Like really, LeBron, do you not understand that Ma'Khia Bryant was in the process of murdering another black girl? Like, did her black life not matter? What's the cop to do if he doesn't shoot Ma'Khia Bryant and the other girl gets killed? They're like, oh, you should have shot. You should have done something. Well, I mean, it was a no-win situation. And, there was an officer, a black officer, I think from LAPD, who put an open letter to LeBron a couple years ago saying, come do a ride along. Right. That would be great. I would love for him to go to Cleveland PD, go to a ride along in the high crime areas of Cleveland. And as I said in a different podcast, LeBron, take some diapers with you because you're going to wet your pants. But see what it's really like. See what cops deal with day in, day out, and then come back and tell me, what the truth is.
I want to get to David Ames brings up a point, says this would be more interesting with an opposing viewpoint. And I'm going to try to be as devil's advocate as much as I can, having read, like I said, your book last night. Yesterday. It's fresh on my mind. But if you want to see Dr. Moravits against opposing viewpoints, you can find those on other podcasts. You can Google him on YouTube and find that. And what I did not like about some of the other podcasts I saw where you clash with an opposing viewpoint is they want to steer you away from the data, and they want to talk about anecdotals. Mm-hmm. And I'm not interested necessarily in that, because we can always find the exception to the rule. But I think
right. I mean, any serious scholar researching anecdotal evidence is basically meaningless.
Yeah.
So we look at trends, we look at aggregate data, and from multiple sources. My book, I don't rely. That particular podcast, the gentleman brought up the FBI Uniform Crime Report. Well, I hadn't even mentioned it yet. I did use it in my book, but I also used the CDC. I used Washington Post data. I used the National Crime Victim Surveys, and they all pretty much show the same thing. So if you are going to say, well, the FBI Uniform Crime Reports are inaccurate because not every agency reports their crime, which is true, but of the 20% or so that don't, the overwhelming majority of those departments have like 5 to 10 officers and rarely experience serious crime.
Yeah.
And so when you look at, and again, even if you don't report everything, you're not going to cover up police killing somebody. That's that was where I really disagreed with him, is that, he tried to make the example of, well, he lives in a white neighborhood and sometimes cops are not going to press charges against those white kids for drugs or for whatever, where they would against black kids. Okay, that may be true, and that may affect the FBI crime report data on drug use, but it has nothing to do with the overall topic of my book, which is, deadly force of police against Black Americans.
Right. Manhar Prosciutto, good morning from South Africa. Manhar, I'm glad you're joining us. It's very good to have you. Dr. Fuller says, these days, the feeling of the famous seem to far outweigh the facts of the experts. Yes.
Yeah, very true. And, going back to the influence of athletes in particular, if you remember the hands up, don't shoot, the Rams were still in St. Louis at the time, and Ferguson, of course, is in Missouri. And they came I think it was 4 wide receivers came out of the tunnel for one game with their hands up. I know some panel on MSNBC did the same thing. And so they're perpetuating this lie that comes from Michael Brown's friend that was with him, Dorian Johnson. And they don't cover the fact that many Black witnesses testified that Michael Brown did not have his hands up, was not saying don't shoot, in fact, was charging back at Wilson after having tried to take his gun. But the media doesn't cover that. They want the sensationalism, and it's not just like what Dr. Fuller was saying, is that it's not just the famous, it's the mainstream media, that really pushes that agenda. And Fox may be the number one cable news network, but when you add up all the liberal ones, most people that are watching news are watching the liberal version. And then you have President Obama out here saying police acted stupidly, or Trayvon could have been my son, or that kind of stuff, and then when he went to the Dallas PD memorial after that Black Lives Matter guy shot and murdered 5 Dallas police officers, I think back in 2015 or so, he kind of lectures the police at a point in that, like, seriously, dude, like, go back and watch that video and look at the faces of the Dallas PD that are standing behind him when he goes on that little rant, and it's just like, that's not the time or place, and so that's why I say, I have nothing personally against Obama. I think if we hung out, we'd have a lot in common. We're both Chicago fans for sports. Beyond that, I don't know how much we get along. But he really, I think, whether he was intentional or not, I think he really made it okay to not trust and not like police. And that's a huge deal, because you have the most powerful person in the world, a Black man, telling people that, and it caused a lot of problems.
I 100% agree with you. I thought, okay, we're finally, when Obama was elected, we're finally going to enter a post-racial America. Thank God. I think we were ready for it. We had, at the time, we had the lapel show, and it felt like we're finally making fun of some of the little funny stereotypes within different racial and ethnic communities. I'm like, it was awesome. And I'm thinking, here we go.
I remember working security right after Obama was elected, and some guy we were detaining said something to the effect of, "It's because we're brown." They were racist because you're white or whatever. I was like, you can't say racist anymore. I said, we've got a Black president. Like, it's done. And of course, that's what I thought in 2009. Yeah. Obviously, I think race relations are worse today in 2022 than they were in 2002.
100%.
And
they're worse. They're as bad as they've been since, what do you think? Since the late 60s, early 70s? What do you think?
Maybe into the early 80s in some places. But, I don't speak for the college I work for. I want to make that clear. But academia has a lot to do with that as well. They push this kind of stuff, but it is gotten worse. And that's very unfortunate. Because now, like, we had a keynote speaker at Convocation, and they were saying it was not an employee of the college, but it was a guest speaker. And I remember listening to this because we're still on Zoom, and she said something to the effect of, being colorblind, which is the Martin Luther King Jr. ideal, one of my heroes. He and George Washington, to me, are probably the two most important Americans of all time. I mean, you could throw Abraham Lincoln in there too, of course, but he wanted a colorblind society, and this lady said, that's a relic of the 20th century. Now we need to focus on color. And I think that mentality is what's another factor dividing us. And, she talked about, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is these buzzwords you hear in colleges and now in corporations. And one thing she made clear was that diversity does not include diversity of thought. She said that diversity of thought, people that argue for that are afraid of speaking about race. Hello, lady. I wrote a book on this. I'm not afraid because I have the facts behind me. But that's just where we are. And hopefully the right person will see my book and get some good exposure. So people that don't like police or that are kind of neutral but believe police are targeting Black people will come to know the reality.
Yeah, and just some of the tweets here. There's the LeBron tweet, quote, "We're literally hunted every day, every time." Those are all caps. "We step foot outside the comfort of our home. Can't even go for a damn jog, man. Like, WTF, man? Are you kidding me?" End quote. And then, of course, Colin Kaepernick. You could throw a dart at his, but there's a ton of ones from him. Well, and to be fair to LeBron, he was talking about Ahmaud Arbery, who was not killed by police. Right. But the sentiment, I think, is the same, that this idea that justice has not come for Black people. And I'm like, okay, you're talking about Georgia, right? It was where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. 3 white men all got convicted on just about every charge by a jury that was 11 white people. Yep. So if that doesn't tell you that racism is, that would have happened 60 years ago, those 3 men probably would never have been charged, much less found guilty. Things have changed. That's the Deep South, and people need to recognize that and acknowledge it, that racism, like Thomas Sowell said, is only kept alive because it's politically expedient. Yeah, and to your point, that, well, he's talking about Ahmaud Arbery, it didn't have anything to do with the police. Well, Sandra Bland is another one. I mean, she committed suicide, and yet her death is conflated with the other police shootings. Right. I mean, and there was the Sandra Bland Act, which increased responsibility on jails and things to make sure that anybody who might be suicidal or mentally ill gets the attention they deserve. But yeah, it had nothing to do with police. I mean, as you know, as a corrections officer and a former cop, once the police turn that person over to the corrections officer, we're done. Like, we do our little booking report and then we take off and go write a report at the station at the end of the shift or something. But we have no control over what she does when she's in her own jail cell. So yeah, that one included in this, just that one makes another one that doesn't make any sense to me because police weren't even involved in it. Yeah. And I want to talk about something that I've heard you say before, Dr. Moravits, on multiple shows I've heard you on, and you mentioned Tom Brady, and I'm going to give the Cliff Notes version. Basically, like if he or one of these, he's the GOAT, right? Greatest quarterback of all time. I think that's that question. But if he screws up or one of his teammates screws up, maybe they're penalized a few yards, maybe they lose a down. But if a law enforcement officer who has spent a lifetime of service and sacrifice makes an error, he doesn't lose a down in a few yards. He's potentially going to prison for the rest of his life. And again, let's remember this, the effect that has on his family when he or she, the law enforcement officer, is taken away and put in prison. That's destroying a generation because of an error, one error, whether that's with or without malice. It just
yeah. I think someone in the chat says Kim Potter. I talk about that in the book as well. That's a tragic situation for all around. I mean, a lot of people may disagree with me on this next comment I make. I'm Catholic. I believe that all human life is sacred. So I think the Black deaths I talked about, even if they were legally justified, I think it's tragic because their families still hurt. Yes. That they were loved by somebody. But someone like Kim Potter. But again, going back to the Tom Brady example, he might throw an interception, lose the game. Well, he gets next week to come back. He's getting next season, right? If a cop makes a mistake, they could get hurt or killed. Someone else could get hurt or killed, or, like you said, they can end up in prison. And people don't understand the complexity of police work. I mean, the knowledge of the law and the procedures isn't that, it's not like astrophysics or anything like that, but that in the field, applying everything all at the same time to dynamic situations is very difficult. I remember my police chief, who incidentally is now a professor at Texas State, Colonel Justice. He's got his PhD. We had lunch not too long ago to kind of catch up. And, he would say 98.5% of Americans could not do this job.
Yes.
And I think he's right. It's tough.
I want to talk another thing you brought up. It's not on the notes, but you said, you went into law enforcement with a certain bias. And if I misquote you, Dr. Moravits, please forgive me, but it was something along the lines of, I figured this is something you do if you have a high school education and not much else going for you. And
well, that was actually what a Texas State student told me. That was my bias. That was the perception from a lot of the college students. And when I know the person's name, I'll never forget him. He was just, oh gosh, talk about a prick. But I'm not going to throw him into the bus. Hopefully he's grown up since then. But my sergeant that was on scene and my fellow officer both had degrees from Texas State. In fact, the sergeant had a master's degree. Of course, I had already graduated from Texas A&M. So I just responded to him, you know what Texas State is? And he's like, what? It's like, that's the college you go to when you can't get into A&M and UT. Mm-hmm. And then that was my comeback. Of course, my partner was like, hey, I went here. And I was like, dude, I don't really mean that. It's just, I'm trying to give it back to this guy. But yeah, no, I just didn't think, I guess as a kid, I was always taught to respect law enforcement. And, one of the guys interviewed me, black guy, Mr. Willies, he said, when I get pulled over by police, my heart is up here in my throat. And I was like, well, I'm not trying to diminish your feelings. It's like, but guess what? When I get pulled over by police, up until the last 10 or so years after I'd been a cop, I would get super nervous. I mean, it wasn't like, but because I understand that, you can get in trouble. Police have the ability to take your liberty or to fine you for traffic or whatever the case may be. But so I definitely respected police, was always professional with them on traffic stops. But the reality is that I wasn't aware of how difficult the job was, because it is a dynamic job that changes every day. And you never know what the person, you pull over someone at a traffic stop, you have no idea who's behind the car. You have no idea what they're planning to do. That's something people don't understand unless you've been there. I mean, you can watch Blue Bloods all day long or, all these police shows, but it's not the same as being behind the badge, having the badge on your chest.
Yeah. Tina is on, says, good morning, Rich and Will. My brother, Jeff, and I were both Marines and both cops. He's retired law enforcement. He says, did you look into the nighttime traffic stop report research showing no racial bias during evening traffic stops?
No, my focus on this book, Jeff, was about deadly use of force. Of a colleague of mine at Texas State, when he found out I was writing this book, I think he may have assumed I was going to draw the opposite conclusion. As he pulled me aside, was like, hey, did you look at this traffic study they did in North Carolina that shows that black people are far more likely to get pulled over or whatever? And I was like, no, I haven't seen that, but I have seen others that show, well, that's because they violate traffic law more often. But to Jeff's point, what people, a few years ago, there was a viral video that on Twitter where a white cop was standing there at the window of a black guy. The black guy was recording. It was obviously dark outside. It was nighttime. And he's just railing on him, like, you pulled me over because I'm black. Like, why did you have your gun out, like, by your side when you approached the car and all this kind of stuff? And I just made the comment, look at, it's nighttime. You can't tell what color a person is when you pull them over in the middle of the night, especially if you're behind them. And one person responded, oh, stop the lies. We know that you run the license plate and you know who's driving. And I was like, well, at least in my department, when we make a traffic stop, you call out the license and dispatch does run it, but they only tell you anything about it if either one, it's a stolen car, or two, you ask them. And beyond that, all that tells you is who owns the car. It doesn't tell you who's behind the wheel. And by someone's last name, you can't always tell if they're white, black, or what. And that my few comments, it was funny, got like 300,000 replies. Like Twitter only let me see the first 100 or so. And it was like, wow, I even ended up on some guy's podcast, a cop, I think the show was the donut operator, but that's the misconception. People have no clue.
No, they don't. And to your point about, you only pulled me over because I was black. When I was stationed at Parris Island, probably a year or two before I retired, I had an African-American sergeant, and he's running late one morning, and he comes in and he's got his head down. I'm like, hey, I'm going to missay his last name just to protect him. I said, hey, Sergeant Haywood, you're late. Everything all right, pal? He's like, driving while black. You know what I'm saying, sir? And I'm like, no, I don't. So that was did you get a citation? He's like, yes, sir. I'm like, for driving while black? Go grab that citation for me, pal. I'm not aware of that charge. So he goes out to his car. He comes back in with the citation. He hands it to me. And it says he's going, 60 in a 40.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, this says 60 and a 40. I don't see anywhere in the citation, Sergeant Hayward, where it says that you were driving while black.
Yeah.
Were you speeding?
That perception. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is, I think we need to combat those instances with the facts when and if they occur. And I tried to help him see the fallacy of that logic. I said, were you speeding? He's like, well, yes, sir, I was. Okay. Were you going 60 and a 40? He's like, more like 65. I'm like, okay, so the cop cut you a break in reality and took five miles off of that. Is that correct? And he's like, well, yes, sir. I'm like, well, then sounds like, you got a break, pal. But my point, I think you see what my point is.
Yeah. Yeah. People just, again, I think it goes back to people still think it's police are the same way they were in the 60s and 70s. And that's just not the case. And in fact, most of the officers I work with were much more likely to give you a verbal warning on a traffic stop than they were to give you a citation. A lot of times it's just one of those things where you just kind of want to, get them to slow down or different things like that. But a lot of times it's you're looking for something else, pull them over for speeding and then, oh, look, there's a big bag of weed or there's, they're drunk or something like that. Those are the things you're looking for, Yeah, if you're going 65 and a 40, you're definitely going to get a ticket. But if you're going 45 and a 40 and you get pulled over, I'm sure some cops will give you a ticket for that. But I kind of had a rule where, because I work night shift and most of my district traffic area that I would do would be Interstate 35 in Texas. And if you were going, the speed limit was 70. If you were going between 70 and 75, I wouldn't pull you over. If you were going between 76 and 80, sometimes, most of the time I pull you over and I give you a warning. But if you're going, 80 or above, then yeah, I'll probably give you a ticket, just depending, on other circumstances. But yeah, driving while black. I mean, I had a guy ask me that on a traffic stop. He was a college student, and he was very polite. He's like, "Can I ask you something?" I was like, "Yes, sir." And he's like, "Did you pull me over because I was black?" And I was really new. That was like, I'd been off of FTO maybe a couple months. And I was kind of like taken aback by it. And I was like, well, sir, it's 3 a.m. Could you tell that I was white when I pulled you over? And he's like, no. And I was like, then how could I tell that you were black? Like, we can't, you know what I mean? It's just it. And he's like, oh, that makes sense. So I was like,
yeah, I think that where I was upset with President Obama, he could have set some of this right. I mean, he's a very intelligent man, very well-spoken man, very charismatic. Like you said, I'm sure if he and I were having a beer in a bar, it would be very pleasant. But I think there was a missed opportunity for 8 years under his administration or perhaps Eric Holder's Justice Department to set some of this correct. And having said that, let's dive into some of your data here. Look at that. How snazzy that is.
Yeah, nice.
So this is the cover of your amazing book, The Blue Divide, and we're going to look at some of the instances of data that you bring out here in chapter 19. Because I want to, you do a really good job, Dr. Moravits, of going into some of the, whether it's Michael Brown or Philando Castile, or which, by the way, was one of the most problematic ones for me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, the Philando Castile, I was teaching about criminal law yesterday in one of my government classes, and I used that example. The officer that shot and killed Philando Castile, I don't know what the training that individual had. I don't know. It was a department in Minneapolis or Minnesota. But my criticism of that was, he did get indicted and he was acquitted because, a reasonable officer might be in fear of his life. People criticize that all the time. Like, if you're scared, you shouldn't be a cop. And I'm like, really?
Yep.
Like, you don't think the people that stormed the beaches of Normandy were scared shitless, but they still did it.
That's right.
So I kind of addressed that too in my book about the physiological effects of stress and things like that on your performance. But my issue with it was he testified that he pulled over this Philando Castile because he looked like a suspect in an armed robbery that happened in that same area a few days earlier. Mm-hmm. So in my training, you don't make that traffic stop like it's a speeding stop. You do a high risk felony traffic stop with a backing officer, and there's a very specific procedure that you get where you get them out of the car in a way that protects them and protects you. And then you get them in handcuffs, and then you look, oh, okay, well, you're not the person we're looking for. I'm sorry, just kind of thing. But he didn't do that. He just kind of walks up nonchalantly, does a traffic stop like it's any old, you got a taillight out or something. And Castile was a licensed gun owner. And he said, I have a gun on me, and he's like, well, don't reach for it. He was reaching, I guess, for his ID or, whatever. And if you watch the video, it's only a dash cam video. There was no body camera, but it happened so fast. I mean, it's chilling to watch it because it's just so fast. And I think had the training been better, or if this officer, if maybe he was trained that way and just didn't follow it, I don't know. But Castile would be alive today. So that one to me was especially tragic because he wasn't the guy that did the armed robbery. His girlfriend and daughter, I think, were in the car with him. And that was very, very tragic and unfortunate.
Yeah. And so, I've had a concealed weapons permit since 1995. And when I get pulled over by law enforcement, because I have a lead foot, I get pulled over all the time.
Yeah.
And my kids have seen this, this idea in the Black community that as a Black parent, you have to have the talk in quotation marks with your children. Well, I think that's something all Americans need to do, and specifically armed Americans. When I pull over, I turn the dome light on. I put all four windows down in my Ford F-150. I have my hands like this on the dash. They approach the car. I'm not reaching, scrambling for anything. There'll be plenty of time to find my ID and driver's license. Hey, good morning, sir. And
right.
Sir, just so you know, I'm armed. What would you like me to do first? And I don't do anything.
Yeah, let them yeah, exactly. And when I heard the other podcast interviewer asked me about said I got to talk. I was like, well, guess what? I did too.
Yes.
And before I was an officer, and before I started carrying concealed, after I was, had left the force, I'd always done the keep your hands in the wheel, 10 to 2, kind of thing, and be roll the window down and just kind of wait for him. But now when I drive a truck and I have a gun hold magnet right underneath the steering column, and that's where my gun is. And so I have not been pulled over with the gun. I do have a lead foot, but I got so many traffic tickets about 12 years ago. I realized I needed to stop. But my plan is if and when that does happen is I'm just going to put my hands on the dash, not the wheel, on the dash, and immediately just tell them exactly like you said. Texas has a law that I don't know exactly when it goes into effect or when they'll start doing it, but it's to graduate high school from a public school, you have to watch a video or go through like a lesson on how to interact with police. And what I did, it's interesting. When I heard about that, I was still teaching public high school, and I was like, "Ooh, I'll teach it." But it didn't go into effect right away. So I'm not really sure what the status of that is today. But what I show my students in class, most of the classes, not all, but most of the classes, I show them the old Chris Rock video, "How Not to Get Your Ass Kicked by the Police."
It's a great one, by the way.
And up until like the very end, it's actually really accurate. And like I said, I don't show that to every class. But if I don't show it to them, I mention, if you're interested, you can find it on YouTube. But it's true. I mean, be polite, respectful, don't run, pull over, that kind of thing. And so I think that is something that every American should do, should have that talk or have that experience.
Yeah, because my own anecdotal experience before I was a police officer, I had law enforcement officers point guns in my face on 2 separate occasions. And one of the occasions, I was a Marine in uniform. I was a sergeant heading to the School of Infantry where I was an instructor. So I was on the road at like 4 a.m. because I had to wake them up for a hike out to Camp Devil Dog. And so I'm in my Jeep. I'm the only one on the road, me and the Onslow County Sheriff's deputy. And I have severe hearing loss from multiple explosions. So I couldn't hear the officer. He's talking to me from the middle of the roadway. I finally go, "Sir, I can't hear you. Sir, I can't hear you." And he keeps talking. So I go to step out of the vehicle. He draws down on me and points a gun at my head. Well, the time to argue with the law enforcement officer isn't at 4 a.m. on the side of the road. I stepped back in, put my hands at 10 and 2, not a problem. I went and got a lawyer, and we went that way. In both instances, I was a young Marine. But my point of saying that is to say there was no white privilege when white officers point guns at my face. They were pointing guns at me because I was doing something that was putting them potentially at risk. And I understand that now. But Dr. Fuller says, even as a white guy and a federal agent, when I used to get pulled over in my bureau vehicle, it was always a very, very touchy situation. Hands stayed on the steering wheel and only moved when told by the officer. It's a potentially dangerous situation for everyone involved and should be treated as such. Full stop. Agree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, you as a cop, you never know who you're pulling over. And, even when you first make contact, you still don't know who that, you got to go run their license. You may not, they may have never been caught in a criminal act yet. And they're like a good criminal that can avoid detection, and maybe they have something on them and they're starting to get hinky and they want to do something to you. You never know. The only time I ever kind of let my guard down on traffic stop is I remember pulled a guy over. The outlet malls in San Marcos were in my district, and it was, again, well past closing time. There's this guy driving around the parking lot, and I'm like, that seems weird, because we had some burglaries in the shopping centers and stuff. So I pull him over, and when I get up there, it's a police officer from another jurisdiction that was lost. And this, it's back before GPS really was available, on your phone and things. And, he showed me his badge, and I was like, "Oh, okay." We talked a little bit, and I was like, "Well, here's where you need to go, whatever, have a great day, stay safe." But other than that, I mean, you just never know. And,
Well, on the relaxing thing. So I carry in the appendix position, and I carry my wallet in my front right pocket. So the gun and the wallet are in close proximity. Mm-hmm. So when they're like, "What would you want me to do first?" And I have my hands on the steering wheel, it's like, "Well, go ahead and grab your wallet. Just so you know, I'm carrying the appendix position, and my wallet's in my right front pocket. Are you so comfortable with that?" And when I do that, the last officer that I had pull me, he literally like leaned into my window, like, "Hey, go ahead," and just kind of hung out there. And of course, I've got a retired Marine license plate. And we always have a really pleasant conversation.
What state do you live in?
Tennessee.
Oh, I love Tennessee. I went to Nashville last summer for the first time. That place is a party city. I loved it. Oh, yeah. I can't wait to go back. We were actually supposed to see Garth Brooks that night at the Nissan Stadium, where you get in the stadium and then like this torrential downpour comes. They end up canceling the concert. So, but we had a lot of fun. But in Texas, I don't know if police are aware of this. GPS in Texas tracks all crime committed by license to carry holders. And license to carry holders are among the most law-abiding citizens you will find anywhere.
Yep.
When they do get arrested, it's mostly or charged, it's mostly because they carried their gun in a place that was prohibited. So if I'm pulling over, knowing that if I'm pulling over someone with a license to carry and they're being respectful like you are, I kind of understand that statistically, this person's pretty safe. But again, are they that 0.0012% that's going to do something bad? You just don't know. Officer safety is paramount because it's just the unknown. It's not that you're scared. It's not that you're paranoid. It's that you're prepared.
Well, one of the things, and we'll talk about this when we dig into your data here in just a second, and that is that there was it like 8% of law enforcement officers that are killed in the line of duty are killed with their own firearm. And I think this is an interesting point that was made when in the police academy. And that was that, and like you, I was president of my police academy and honor graduate, so we have that in common. But one of the instructors made a comment. He said, "What percentage of the time as a law enforcement officer do you think you're going to go on a call where there's a firearm involved?"
Mm-hmm.
And the class is 10%, 15, 20%, maybe 2%. Is like 100% because you brought the firearm to the incident.
Right.
And so again, when we talk about officer safety, it's like, well, what are you worried about? Well, I've got a gun on me, and sometimes 8% of the time, law enforcement officers are killed with the gun that I brought to the fight.
Right. I remember in the academy, they showed us several videos of cops getting their ass kicked on a traffic stop because they had a poor officer safety. They showed us several police officers getting killed. There was one in Texas. I remember as Constable Lunsford.
Yes.
Big old country boy, 6'4", big dude. And he pulls over a car with 3 Hispanic men in it that were all compared to him, were very small. But his officer safety was terrible. And they end up, like at one point he's talking to one of them. The other 2 are, you can see them on the dash cam, like talking to each other, like planning, okay, let's go get this guy. So they tackle him, take his gun, kill him, and leave. And it's that people just, they don't get it unless they've been there. And that's because you just never know.
No.
I want to go back to, if you don't mind, I know you had that slide up a few minutes ago to kind of go over, so our viewers can kind of see what I wrote here. I use this because they say that, police shooting of Black people is a pandemic or endemic, or, it's a health issue, national health crisis, whatever. But if you look at the data, and I use 2014 simply because the Washington Post data kind of lags in some of these things, but I compared the CDC data from 2014 to the Washington Post police shooting data of 2015. And you look at, the number, you're 16.3 times more likely in police homicides, 30.5 times more likely to die from falling. And the one that I always is just shocking to me, and I don't think it's actually, I think it's not in this particular slide. I don't see it, but every year, and okay, here it is. Yeah, the next part. Every year, on average, about 250,000 people were killed or died as a result of mistakes by medical professionals. Mm-hmm. So that means your chances of dying because of a medical malpractice or medical mistake is 254 times higher than at the hands of police. All else being equal. I mean, obviously, there's other variables there, but the reality is, so do we defund doctors? Do we like, oh my gosh, doctors are a national health crisis? No, of course not. But police, it's politically expedient. It gets votes, it gets people riled up, and it's just so unfortunate.
I like this one. I like this slide too, Dr. Moravits. For we interact with police about the same amount of time we interact with law enforcement. And that is, maybe once a year, maybe once every other year, we go to the doctor for a checkup, what have you. Mm-hmm. And we go in there and we completely disrobe. We're disarmed in the sense that, we trust that physician or a clinician has our best interest at heart. And yet they are 254 times more likely to kill us than the law enforcement officer who has a gun, by the way, on the side of the road. So And I use this with a very liberal friend of mine who was a professor and actually wrote a textbook on medicine. I'm like, this is the fourth leading cause of death is medical malpractice in the United States. Fourth leading cause behind cancer, heart disease, and I forget the other one. But I mean, and yet we never want to defund doctors. And look at the amount of education they have compared to a police officer who has less formal education than a hairdresser does in most instances. I know that one of my daughter has a cosmetology degree. She has more hours to get her license than the average police officer does.
Yeah. And, another, you're putting on this one. Yeah. But that perception that police are hunting black people or whatever. Ami Horowitz, who does these Ami on the street videos. I've shown several in my class where he does like voter ID stuff, or, he's really does a lot of good stuff. And he was in Minnesota not too long after, I think it was after George Floyd was killed, but it was at some point, I don't know if it was the trial had started yet. But again, he asked them how many people are killed by police every year. And they were like, unarmed people killed by police every year. I was like, hundreds. And they're like, oh, wait, you mean in the entire United States? And he's like, yeah, in the entire United States. And it's like, it's got to be thousands. And he's like, the actual number was 9. Yeah. And to piggyback off of that particular thing is that the actual number that year, in fact, was 9. But yeah, between 10 and 20, again, it kind of varies year to year. The other thing I address is this whole idea of an unarmed subject is not a deadly threat. First of all, when you look at rifles, right? The dreaded AR-15, the assault rifle that's so scary looking, kills about 45 people a year. All rifles combined kill around 300 and 350, depending on the year. Over 600 people get killed with fists and feet.
Yeah.
Right. Using a blunt object you're more likely to be killed by a blunt object than you are a rifle, any type of long gun, including shotguns. And just, again, it's all about political expediency. We push this narrative of the scary AR-15. We lie about its capabilities. It's a fully automatic, whatever, and all this kind of stuff. It's just, it's so frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And of course we can't ban hands and feet. And I was going to say that, as far as unarmed does not mean harmless. And I think that's one of the conclusions they come to at the end of the Department of Justice report on the Michael Brown shooting. Right. And I don't know if that was a Sixth Circuit court or what justice made that opinion, but he's absolutely right. If you look at, I do jujitsu. I'm completely unarmed when I'm on the mat with someone. It's just 2 guys wearing pajamas. And yet, I've choked people unconscious. I've seen friends get their arms broken, because they didn't want to tap to an arm bar. So I'm by no means harmless when I'm unarmed. What's that?
Well, and that's something I say that ego sometimes can get you. I didn't like to tap either when I did MMA. A couple times I hyperextended my elbow. It popped, it was like, oh crap. And then I tapped. Yeah. But yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book is this sense of, unarmed people can't hurt you. Unfortunately, because most police are not trained in those combative arts. You go through the police academy and you'll get some boxing and maybe some moves on the ground. You'll practice a few times, but you take your average high school wrestler, male high school wrestler, varsity wrestler. They could probably take down and hold on the ground about 90% of police officers without much trouble.
That's right.
And once they're on the ground, then they can take their gun. And as you mentioned, there's 100% of the time there's a gun there, and then they can use that. Furthermore, if you've got somebody who's been doing jujitsu for years, or like I didn't do jujitsu with a gi, I was doing mixed martial arts. So all my jujitsu was no gi. But yeah, it would be so easy for someone like us who's trained to disarm an officer who was not trained. So I like that there's an upward trend of cops training in these kind of combative martial arts, because, I think that's going to helped them immensely. I didn't train when I had been a cop. I trained after. I found out very quickly that I couldn't fight very well. But there were some officers that were doing jujitsu and MMA at the time. And what I noticed looking back on it is that they didn't use higher levels of force as often in bad situations because, one, they were comfortable on their back. They had confidence in their abilities. They knew they could get up off the ground. They knew that they could protect themselves. And when that happens, you're less likely to panic and reach for a weapon. So I would hope that departments would push that more often. I know that some MMA schools can get pretty expensive. I get that, but it $200 a month versus ended up in a pine box,
Well, my jiu-jitsu school, they do an adopt a cop program to pay for that for law enforcement, which is amazing. And I think Andrew Yang was one of the first political candidates that said all law enforcement officers should be trained to at least a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, which is a very high level, by the way.
That's a lot of years. That's 5-6 years maybe.
Yeah, that's really good. I have put up there's a link in today's show notes right here of all the unarmed African Americans killed by law enforcement in the United States, and it gives you the breakdown on every single one of them, whether that officer was prosecuted or not. And so this isn't just an unknown sea of men and women that are losing their lives at the hand of law enforcement. It's small numbers. We track the data, and it's there for you. Guile is joining us from the Philippines this morning. Good morning, Guile. Thanks for coming in. Jason Fitzpatrick says, sorry for being late. Jason, we're just happy that you were here, sir.
Yeah, but what they say, better late than never, except for when you go fishing, then it's better never than late.
Let's look at some of this other data you got here, Dr. Moravits. It says, furthermore, from 2013 to 2015, 11% of all police murdered in the line of duty were killed by assailants who would be considered unarmed by the definition of the Washington Post.
Right. And that's compared to 9% of police homicides of an unarmed assailant. And the quotations are there because Washington Post, if you've got a club type weapon, like a bat or a really thick, 2x4 or something like that, you're considered unarmed in their data, which anybody with a brain cell knows that you can kill somebody with a bat. I mean, there's a really vivid scene in the movie Casino where Joe Pesci's character gets beaten to death with a baseball bat. Yeah. It's a pretty brutal way to die, but yeah, it's ridiculous if they think that.
Now, if you're listening to this on a podcast form, I apologize. We're discussing some data that is on a PowerPoint slide that you can't see. So I would encourage you, if you're listening to us this morning and you're like, I don't understand the context, please check out this video. You can find it on YouTube or on our Facebook page.
Better yet, go buy the book.
Yeah, better yet, look at that. Buy the book. Absolutely. I highly encourage you to buy the book because you'll be armed with facts and data. You can have intelligent, honest, open conversations with folks that you know and potentially care about.
Right.
Let's see here. I want to get to some of the other ones here. Yeah, this is an interesting one.
Well, can we come back to this one? Go back a couple of slides if you would.
Sure, right there.
So one of the things that I point out is that when you see the media report police shootings, they often say, Black people account for 13% of the population, but they're like 26 to 27% of police shootings. Therefore, it's discriminatory, right? That's the data that they usually put out. Politicians will repeat it ad nauseum as well, but that overlooks a very big piece of this puzzle, right? Because they say, well, 65% of America is white. They only account for about 47% of police homicides, so they're underrepresented. Mm-hmm. When you got to factor in how often people commit crime and what type of crime and how often they encounter police. And the reality is, since 1980, we've been tracking data on race as far as who does the homicides, and Black males, young Black males are about 3% of the population, and they account for about 51% of all homicides. And it's a very small number of that 3% that's committing the homicides. But, violent crime and other categories, the same trend emerges. And so what the media is doing is basically saying, 80% of the fouls called in the NBA are against black people. And since black males are only 6.6% of the population, that means there's bias, right? That's effectively what they're saying. And of course, anybody, again, with a brain cell knows that the vast majority of the NBA is black. So it's not a valid argument at all.
Now, I love that when I read that in the book, and that's one of the reasons I want to copy and put that in there. Let's see here. Doug asked, link to the book. It's in today's show notes, and I've posted it in there as well, so you can definitely pick that up, and I highly encourage you to do so. I'm just going to kind of move through some of these slides so that we have time to get to some of this data, and if you see something that you want to jump on, Doctor, please do so.
Okay.
This was an interesting one for me. Again, utilizing the Washington Post data from 2015, there were 248 black people killed by the police. And in the 2015 U.S. Census Bureau estimated the population of black males in America to be 21,213,000, et cetera. That means in 2015, 0.000001169% of black men were killed by the police. That's astronomically low. Page 136 of your book.
Right. And one of the reasons why I use the Washington Post data is because it is the highest number. When you look at the CDC data, the number of police killings of Americans, as reported by coroner's reports, usually is between 420 and 480. Washington Post estimates it closer to 1,000. So I'm using their data because, it's an overestimation of the actual account, but even then it's astronomically low. And obviously not all black males are going to encounter police at the same rate. This is, again, just kind of, a basic type analysis, but it's not getting hunted every time you leave the house, LeBron. I mean, in fact, here's something that people may not know. CDC data shows that until a black man is 45, the number one cause of death for them is homicide.
And that speaks to this slide, and perhaps this is a good one to discuss, because this one kind of blew me away. If you want to talk to this one, Dr. Moravits.
Sure. So in 2014, 6,789 black men were killed by homicide, 93% of those by other black males. So the Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, of course, was a school founded by Booker T. Washington, tallied all lynchings. And this is kind of relevant because they just signed in an anti-lynching law into law recently. Biden was all like, so proud of it. And it's like, no one's been lynched in America in like 40 years, dude. But okay. Anyways, from 1882 to 1968, which is basically the civil rights era, 3,446 black people were lynched. So basically what we're talking about is that in about 6 months, black men will kill more black men than the KKK and other white supremacist groups lynched over a period of 86 years. That
I had never looked at that data that way, and that kind of really blew my hair back. But it's it's true. You can't argue with this, and this is some of the stuff that I wish Obama or Eric Holder would have said instead, or even Kamala. I mean, she's a lawyer. Come on, you know this.
Well, you would think, but if you've heard her speak recently, she's not the sharpest tool in the shed. At least she's not the kind of orator that Abraham Lincoln was, or something. But
yeah. But to your point, Dan, then we're getting anti-lynching laws in 2022 when the data indicates that you're far more likely to slip in a bathtub and then get hit by a meteor than you are to be killed in a lynching in America.
Mm-hmm.
Some of your data really speaks to the fact that homicides are committed in a disproportionate by African Americans. Now, what is the causation for that? I don't know. That's for someone else to take on, which is
right.
not.
I mean, I think
not the point of your book, I guess I should say.
No, I mean, one of the things I've said in other podcasts is, I believe all Black lives matter.
Yes.
One of the issues I have, and I have quite a few conservative Black friends who feel the same way, but of course, when they speak out, they're called Uncle Tom or, a house N-word or whatever. But I do believe all Black lives matter. Again, based on my Catholic faith. And again, I don't know, not everybody's going to agree with that. That's okay. But why are we not focused on this data? Why is it that all we focus on as a society is when cops kill Black people? Around this time that there was all these rallies, like the 2020 to 2021 with the Black Lives Matter movement just being everywhere, a 7-year-old Black girl named Jaslyn Adams was executed while sitting in the passenger car of her dad's vehicle while they're in line at McDonald's. No calls for justice, no parade, no marches, none of that kind of stuff, because it doesn't fit the narrative, right? It was a Black man that executed the two of them. And that's unfortunate. I mean, this young Black girl that was, she sang at either Obama's 2009 inauguration or the 2013, I can't remember which. But then a few weeks later, she was shot and killed in a drive-by in Chicago. And she wasn't the target. She was just outside playing and she got killed, and I didn't hear Obama say anything about her.
Yeah, I've mentioned this on this show.
He did, but I didn't hear that.
No, on this show before, I mentioned I was when I was with the American Red Cross, I was sitting there reading a book at a conference one day, and then an African-American woman, an absolute sweetheart, she came up to me. She saw me reading this book about the Glock handgun, and she said, both of my sons were killed by Glock firearms. And it was very solemn. And I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And she's like, yeah, I've spoken out on against gun violence and et cetera, et cetera. Well, on another break, I got to know her and we chatted and had lunch together. And the backstory was her two African-American sons that were killed by Glocks were killed at the hands of African-American men in the commission of their drug activity. And so it had nothing to do with the firearm, and it had everything to do with the lifestyle that they were engaged in, the criminality they were involved in. So I think that gets missed on people.
Right.
This data right here, if you want to talk to this, this is very interesting to me, Dr. Moravits.
Yeah. So quite a bit of the, well, I wouldn't say quite a bit, but a significant part of the data that I use comes from Heather McDonald's book from 2016 called The War on Cops. She tackles more or less the same subject I do, but in a much different way. But her research was very valuable to me. And she looked at the 75 largest counties as far as population in America, because we see that Black people are more likely to live in urban centers than they are in rural America. Overall. And they were charged with 62% of robberies, 57% murders, 45% of all assaults, while accounting for 15% of the population. In 2015 alone, there were estimated 385 million police contacts with citizens, resulting in 990 people killed, 248 of them Black. So if we assume then, based on let's just take the low number, that half of all felonies are committed by Black men specifically. That means and so we say half of all these police contacts, 385 million, were of Black people. That means the odds of a Black person being killed during a police contact was 0.0000128%. I mean, come on now.
Which is the same as winning a lottery or something like that, I'm sure.
Probably. I mean, I don't know what that number is, but it seems probably pretty close.
Yeah. We talk in chapter 20, you go into the biased criminal justice system, and this is pulled from page 148 of your book, which again, I found very interesting.
Okay. Which one is this? Yeah. So, one of the things that the criticism from that other podcast that you're mentioning, and I just want to say that for those of you that see that podcast, it was a progressive leftist, self-described Black man. We had a great conversation. It was constructive. Yeah. He wrote up a wonderful article. Yeah. He wrote up a wonderful article in the Daily Cost, about that interview and how these are the conversations we need to have more often. But one of the criticisms he had is the FBI Uniform Crime Report being biased because it's based on police reporting. And my response to that, and then in the book I talk about this here, is that when you compare the FBI data to the CDC, which is they report homicides from the coroner's office, right? And then you also look at the National Crime Victim Survey, which has nothing to do with police. The arrest rates of blacks and whites match up very closely to the victim reports of, is the offender black or white? So even if you take the FBI data out and you're just looking at non-police collected data or non-law enforcement collected data, it matches up really well. But people, again, they don't understand, they use anecdotal evidence like, oh, well, Rich, you committed aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and you only got 5 years. And then this guy over here, this black guy, got 10 years. Well, that may be the case, but there might be a legitimate explanation of that. Maybe this other guy had a long rap sheet, or maybe it was just a more serious offense. It's like, well, wait a minute. So here's the example I give my kids. My students, I should say. I shouldn't call them kids, I guess. But you take a baseball bat and you hit somebody in the leg and break their leg, and then you walk away. That's aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
Yes.
Right? Then next scenario, you hit somebody in the leg with their bat, you break their leg, then you hit the other leg, break that one, break both their arms, and hit them across the jaw, dislocate their jaw, break their teeth, whatever. Who's going to get the harsher sentence? It's the same charge, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Which one's going to get the longer sentence, right? The one that beat you near death. And so that's another factor that, they don't look at. And I can come up with anecdotal evidences where white people were sentenced more for the same crime than a black person in the same city. So again, that's why anecdotal evidence from a statistician standpoint, really are meaningless. You got to look at the aggregate data.
No, I absolutely 100% agree with you. And this, I believe this is the last slide, Dr. Moravits. It says, looking at the 75 largest counties, as mentioned earlier, the Department of Justice in 1994 found that black people were less likely to be prosecuted following a felony than white people, and they were less likely to be found guilty at trial, which is, again, counter to the media's narrative.
Yeah, again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse, but it's all about political expediency and what gets votes. Candace Owens always say that Democrats only pay attention to black people every 4 years, and when they do, they just talk about racism. And the reality is, this is going back 3 decades now. I mean, it's 28 years ago. Again, the 75 largest counties by population. We know that urban areas have a higher percentage of crime than rural areas. The DOJ found this, and this has been found by criminologists. I mentioned a couple of in the book, and it's just it doesn't fit the narrative, and so it gets ignored by those who could actually make a difference.
Yeah, totally. And you talk about George Floyd as one of the case studies in the book, and like you and probably, and I've said this on this podcast and elsewhere, if you kneeled on my neck for almost 9 minutes, whatever it was, I probably would expire too. I mean, and I think
some people say, well, he might have died anyways because of fentanyl or whatever. There's no excuse in my mind. And I talked with my former chief about this, that, it was a legitimate technique taught in the Minneapolis police manual, but for 9 minutes, especially after he passes out at one point, like halfway through, I don't understand that, at all. But even Keith Ellison, who was the attorney general for Minnesota, who used to be a Democratic national congressman, I think, black man, said that we have no evidence that race had anything to do with this.
I don't think that it had anything to do with it. I think it just, I don't know, that the guy was having a bad day. I know he was in the midst of a divorce. I don't know what he was thinking, but have I put my knee on people's neck? Absolutely. Am I going to do it tonight when I go to jiu-jitsu? Probably. And you know what? The guy's going to live, because I'm not going to keep my knee on their neck once they pass out. I just don't.
Well, I mean, and you can make a legitimate medical argument that had he not been high on fentanyl, that knee on the neck wouldn't have killed him. One of the things that people have to understand is in Minnesota law, intent to kill or intent to murder or whatever you want to call it is not required to be found guilty of second and third degree murder. And so that played a big part of it. And of course, he was never going to get a fair trial. He was never, I mean, jurists admitted that afterwards that they knew they had to find him guilty. But
well, we hear about George Floyd, and when nobody knows the name Tony Timpa.
Yeah, a couple of people. I would always ask this in my classes. Who knows who George Floyd is? The last couple of years I've been asking that. And of course, everybody raises their hand, and I was like, well, who knows who Tony Timpa is? And like maybe one or two. Well, for those of you that aren't aware that are listening, Tony Timpa was a white man living in Dallas, Texas. And in 2016, he was suffering from a mental health episode, and he called 911. Police show up and end up putting him in handcuffs, putting him on the ground on the prone or on his stomach like George Floyd was. And the body cam footage shows they had their knee on the back of his neck, not on the side, but on the back. Like, if you kind of feel that bump you have where your neck kind of meets your spine. And they held him down there for quite a while.
14 minutes.
He was saying, I can't breathe. He ends up passing out. They're making fun of him. Like, come on, wake up, time to go to school, stuff like that. And he died.
Yep.
No marches, no national media coverage. The only place you could hear about it is the Dallas Morning News. I think it's the Dallas Morning News, the local news agencies. MSNBC didn't talk, because no one cares. No one cares when white men are killed by police. I talked about several cases that the circumstances around it are very similar to some of the ones of the black people in my book. But again, it's all local media that covers it, because the national media, it's not going to, who cares, right? It doesn't fit their narrative. They can't show that information, because if they do, then they can't, get ratings, views for, showing stuff about Black Lives Matter, about, Breonna Taylor or anything like that. And the lies around Breonna Taylor are ridiculous. Like, people still out there think she was shot while she was asleep in bed, or that she was totally innocent, and there was no, they were at the wrong place. I've gotten to know through Twitter, Sergeant John Mattingly, who I write about in my book. He was the officer in Louisville that was shot by Breonna Taylor's boyfriend in that raid. He came out with a book a couple weeks ago called 12 Seconds in the Dark. And it's basically the whole, like, dispelling all the myths. It's a short book. It's a good read. That's another book I highly recommend you guys check out, in addition to mine. But it's just, we need more voices like that speaking out, and we need the bigger news agencies to pay attention,
And when I read that chapter in your book about Breonna Taylor, there was so much I did not know, because part of it goes back to, as a criminal investigator in the Marine Corps, I can tell you that I'm not discussing the facts of the case until I'm done with the case. It would do me no good until I remember when the convening authority for the court martial be like, Rich, where are you at on this? I'm like, sir, I'm still investigating. I still got to talk to witnesses. I still got to put this case together. I'll give it to you when it's done, because I don't want to bias any outcomes. Well, if you look at that chapter in your book regarding Breonna Taylor, there's so much nuance, and the media is terrible at nuance, right? I mean, they want to say a black woman killed in her apartment in a no-knock raid. And it's like, well, no, there's a whole lot more to it than that. So again, read Dr. Moravits' book, and every one of these cases that he talks about are very layered, very contextual. It's not as simple, cut and dry as people would wish it was.
Yeah, definitely. And it just goes back to my earlier point that the police work is dynamic, and it's never the same, and you have to evaluate the totality of the circumstances. But the media loves to sensationalize, and Ben Crump, the attorney for Breonna Taylor's family, and he's also been kind of out there for some of these other incidences. He just flat out lies. I mean, he's not. I mean, he's just a liar and a fraud. But
he's made himself a multi-millionaire in the process, right?
Yeah, he really has. Let me just say one more thing, not to give away everything in my book, but Breonna Taylor's mom reported that the Louisville chapter of Black Lives Matter raised all this money and for her, in her daughter's name. but did not give her anything. She said, in fact, that I could show up at a Black Lives Matter chapter meeting in Louisville and no one would know who I was. So if that's just one of many examples you can use about the whole organization itself doesn't really care about Black lives. They care about money in their pocket. And, so there's a big difference between saying Black Lives Matter, the idea, and then Black Lives Matter, the organization.
And I remember, I was a police officer in the mid and late 90s. So I came in on the heels of course, the 1991 arrest of Rodney King. And one of the things that the media always, of course, they took that film that Mr. Holiday filmed and chopped off, I think, 10 seconds that showed context 13. And all you 13 seconds. So thank you. Yeah. But what they never talked about was Freddie Helms and Bryant Allen. And that was the other two African-American males that were in the vehicle with Rodney King that night. And the police did not take them into custody. They may have received some level of force in getting them on the ground. But my point being that if you decide to fight the police, if you're white, black, green, or red, expect the level of force used against you, which goes back to one of the first chapters in your book, talks about. And I think, let me pause there. I think this is also important for folks that are not in law enforcement to understand. I don't have the luxury of walking away from this. I have to be here by virtue of my profession, by virtue of the oath I took in the mayor's office when I became a law enforcement officer, by virtue of the commission signed by the governor of the great state of Tennessee. I don't get the luxury of going, oh, okay, you didn't do nothing. Okay, well, have a nice day, sir. I'm going to walk away. I have to be here.
Yeah, for sure. And, there's a duty there. Real quick before I go further, Mr. Parker says, where can I purchase? Yeah, Amazon's the easiest. Just for those of you out there, if you want to save a little money, the Kindle or paperback version is obviously cheaper than the hardcover. And shameless promotion, I actually make a bigger profit off of those than I do the hardcover. So, and unless you just really want the hardcover, it's a real nice book, But when you talk about, this issue, one of the things that frustrates me most is just the total lack of understanding by the common American. The common American looks at Hollywood movies and TV shows, and they think that that's what it's like being a cop. They think that every cop should be like Bruce Willis in Die Hard. And the reality is we're human beings, right? We're fathers and brothers and mothers and daughters and sisters and wives and husbands. And, we have feelings, we have good days, we have bad days. We just want to go home at the end of our shift. That's what people understand. And there's so much misinformation out there. And I hope this book will help dispel some of that. That's my purpose of writing. That's why I took the time to do it.
And Dr. Moravits, I kept you on here for quite some time, so we definitely need to wrap up. I know you have other things to do today. Once again, I wanted to echo something that you said multiple times. Any loss of life is tragic, regardless of one's the amount of melanin in one's skin. Any loss of life as a Christian is too much. And there are instances where, unfortunately, in society and legally, where the killing is awful for the families involved, but it's also lawful for everyone involved. So I just echo what you said earlier. All lives matter. Black lives matter. Every life matters. And thank you for coming on today. And thank you for taking the time to put this amazing book together. And I hope that everyone reads it.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. I wish we should do this again and keep going next time.
I would absolutely love it. And like I said, maybe, I would really love to explore this further with you in the future.
Same.
All right, sir. Well, thank you for coming on today. Please check out Dr. Moravits' amazing book. I bought it in Kindle, and I highly encourage that. I don't normally consume books in Kindle, but it gave me the ability to take detailed notes in reading it so that I can share this information with others. And Dr. Moravits, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everyone that's watching today. Remember, the fight is coming.